Welcome to episode 2 of The Hollow Between, a podcast of folklore, ghost stories, and the uncanny. I'm Candace, and tonight, beside the lantern light, I have a story for you. So settle in with a blanket and a cup of something warm. There is something strangely human about gathering in the dark to tell stories. Long before electric lights glowed in our windows, people sat beside fires and candles and spoke of strange things, of spirits glimpsed along lonely roads, of voices heard through the walls of old houses, of figures standing silently in forests at dusk. And perhaps what is most curious of all is that we still do, even now. We still lower our voices when speaking about the uncanny. We still feel a chill when a floorboard creaks in an empty house. We still tell ghost stories during storms and long winter nights. Perhaps because somewhere deep within us, we have never entirely stopped believing. Ghost stories are among the oldest stories we possess. Long before books lined shelves, before radios hummed softly in sitting rooms, before films flickered across silver screens, people gathered in the dark and told stories about the things they could not explain. Around fires, beside hearths, beneath the lantern light. And I think there's something important in that. These stories were rarely told in the brightness of midday. They belonged to evening, to storms, to winter, to those strange and quiet hours when the world feels softer around the edges. Folklore was never just entertainment, it was memory. A way for people to carry warnings, grief, beliefs, and wonder through generations long before history was carefully written down. Some stories warned travelers not to wander lonely roads after dark. Others cautioned against entering forests alone, or standing too close to deep water, or opening the door to strangers at impossible hours. And perhaps on the surface, these tales seem simple. Superstitions, rural fears, old-fashioned beliefs. But beneath many ghost stories lies something deeply human. The fear of loss, the fear of death, the fear of being forgotten. I sometimes think ghost stories endure because grief itself is haunting. When we lose someone we love, they don't simply vanish from us. They linger in houses, in objects, in habits, in certain songs and seasons. We hear echoes of them in empty rooms. We dream of them. We feel their absence so vividly that it almost begins to feel like presence. And so perhaps it's no surprise that nearly every culture on earth has imagined spirits lingering at the edges of the living world. Not always malevolent, often simply unfinished. And then, of course, there was the Victorian era, one of my true favorites, a time when grief itself seemed woven into daily life. Death was familiar then in many ways that we've forgotten today. Families draped mirrors in mourning cloth. They kept locks of hair from lost loved ones. They sat for post-mortem photographs. They held seances by candlelight in darkened parlors, hoping desperately for one more word from those who had passed beyond our reach. Spiritualism flourished during those years, not merely because people wished to believe in ghosts, but because people wished to believe that love could survive death. And honestly, I think some part of us still does. Even now, we continue telling these stories. We still gather around fires. We still lean closer when someone quietly says, "This really happened." we still feel connected through the sharing of strange experiences because eerie stories do something unusual. They remind us that we're not alone in our uncertainty. They allow us to sit together in the mystery for just a little while longer. And perhaps that's the real purpose of ghost stories. Not just to frighten us, but to help us speak about longing, memory, death, and the great unknown in ways that ordinary conversation rarely allows. A ghost story is rarely just a ghost story. More often, it's an emotional truth wearing the clothing of the uncanny. So tonight, I want to leave you with one such story, an old story carried quietly through generations. In the Appalachian Mountains, stories have always traveled differently, passed from porch to porch, from grandparents to children, shared softly beside wood stoves while rain tapped against old windows. And many of those stories begin the same way, with someone insisting they did not believe in such things until something happened that could not quite be explained. Tonight's story comes from eastern Kentucky, though versions of it appear throughout the mountains in different forms. It's a story about grief, about loneliness, and about the unsettling feeling that some places remember the people who once walked there. In the winter of 1931, a widow named Eliza Whitcomb lived alone on a narrow valley road just outside a small coal town. Her husband, Thomas, had died the previous autumn in a mining accident several miles away, leaving Eliza alone in the little white farmhouse they had shared for nearly 20 years. According to neighbors, she changed after his death. Not suddenly, but quietly. She stopped attending church socials. She stopped tending her gardens. She stopped lingering on neighbors' porches. But the strangest change was this. Every evening just before dark, Eliza lit an oil lantern and placed it carefully in the front window. And every morning, she extinguished it only after sunrise. Even during storms, even when oil became difficult to afford. When neighbors finally asked her why she insisted upon it, Eliza answered only, "So he can find his way home." Most people assumed grief had unsettled her, and perhaps it had, but then came the footsteps. The Whitcomb house sat not far off the main road, surrounded by woods and steep hills that carried sounds strangely after dark. One January evening, shortly after a heavy rain, Eliza arrived at a neighbor's house visibly shaken. She claimed someone had walked across her porch the midnight before, not quickly, not angrily, but slowly, back and forth, heavy boots against the wet wood of the porch. Step, 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 for nearly an hour. Eliza said she had remained frozen in bed, listening to the sound drift past the front window again and again. Each time the footsteps reached the lantern, they paused. Her neighbor offered practical explanations. A traveler, a drunk, someone playing a cruel joke. But Eliza shook her head. "No," she whispered. "It was him." Over the following weeks, strange things quietly gathered around the property. Neighbors passing after dusk reported seeing a figure standing near the tree line behind the house. Tall, motionless, sometimes carrying what appeared to be a lantern of its own. Yet whenever anyone approached, the figure vanished into the fog. Then came the knocking. 3 knocks, always after midnight. always at the front door. Eliza never answered. But once, according to her own account, she stood near enough to the door to hear breathing on the other side. Slow, exhausted. Then very softly, someone whispered her name. Eliza. She told no one about that part until much later. The mountains were in deep winter by then. Bare branches, frozen mud, snow gathering in the hollows. One evening, a storm rolled through the valley so fiercely that nearby families later claimed the windows rattled in their frames all night. Several people reported seeing a strange amber light moving slowly through the woods toward the Whitcomb house. Not flickering wildly, but steady, purposeful. And according to one account, there appeared to be a second figure walking just behind it. Taller, darker, somehow wrong in its proportions, but impossible to see clearly through the storm. The following morning, neighbors found Eliza sitting quietly on the porch wrapped in blankets. The lantern beside her had gone cold. For the first time in months, it burned out before dawn. Snow had drifted across the porch boards around her chair, but what unsettled neighbors most were the footprints. There was only one set leading toward the house, and none leading away. The tracks ended directly beneath the front window, as though whoever had crossed the valley during the storm had simply stopped there. Eliza herself seemed oddly peaceful. When asked if she was all right, she smiled faintly and said, "He found the house at last." A few days later, she left the valley to live with relatives farther south, and the Whitcomb house remained empty for years. Travelers still claim to see lantern light glowing faintly through the front window during storms. Eventually, according to local accounts, the property was purchased by a young couple from out of state who dismissed the old valley stories as superstition. They lasted less than a winter. Neighbors later claimed the lights in the farmhouse would flicker strangely during the storms, despite the fact that the electricity had been shut off. That the porch front lantern, long since removed, sometimes appeared glowing faintly through the fog after midnight, especially in the winter, especially on nights thick with fog. And according to local stories, if you stand quietly enough near the old porch after midnight, you may still hear slow footsteps crossing the floorboards, back and forth, pausing always beneath the front window as though something is still searching for the warmth in the dark. Or perhaps waiting patiently to be let inside. I don't know about you, but I certainly won't be opening my front door if I hear footsteps on my porch tonight. So, perhaps this is why ghost stories endure. Not because we wish to be frightened, but because these stories remind us that the world has edges still untouched by certainty. Places where memory lingers. Places where grief speaks softly through old walls and empty roads. Places where the dark is not always empty. And before the lantern light fades for the evening, if you have a ghost story, family legend, uncanny experience, regional folklore tale, or strange happening you would like to share, I would love to hear it. Please send your stories to thehollowbetween@gmail.com, and perhaps your story might be shared here beside the lantern light. So until next time, my friends, mind the hollow between. While many of the traditions, places, and legends discussed in tonight's episode are rooted in history and folklore, the featured narrative was created for The Hollow Between.